Hello and welcome to this webinar from IEDP Developing Leaders. I am Ronnie Miller and I'm delighted to have Marc Ventresca, Associate Professor of Strategic Management from the Oxford Said School of Business, leading today's presentation on Explore versus Exploit, Reimagining the Firm and the Economy for Renewal and Recovery. Now, Marc is currently based in California and will be joining us in just a few minutes. We're having a small technical problem, but he'll be here very shortly. And whilst we wait, I thought I would just highlight the program that he will be leading shortly, online program, Oxford Strategic Innovation Program, which, like today's webinar, is focusing on innovation strategies within the organization, how to deconstruct and redefine what innovation means, explore different ways of navigating innovation and engaging, and it will engage with a global cohort of like-minded professionals like all online programs at Oxford do. This will be 6 weeks, and you can see on the screen now the link that you would need to click on if you want to find out some further information. But I think Marc is now with us, so let's go straight over to him. Marc, you're very welcome.
Let's push ahead. They can hear us. Okay, great. Roddy, thank you for having me. I'm so sorry for the hassle of coming in. Should we just plunge right in?
I think plunge right in.
Let me just quickly kind of cut through to the chase. We're here today to talk about Exploit, Explore, an idea that comes out of strategy to help us reimagine the firm and really the economy in this period of renewal and recovery. I'm really grateful to Roddy for hosting and colleagues at Oxford Said, including Michele Scatolini, who made this possible. I'd like to just open up with really 4 tasks that I think are important. And Roddy, I'm happy to go back and forth with you and questions, and also happy for colleagues in the audience to share through the chat. I think there are 4 things to keep in mind. We're in difficult times. The times today are not historically unique. There have been many other difficult times where there's a confluence of large-scale public health initiatives, complex politics, and often economic difficulties, economic turmoil. So I want to briefly remind us about the work of Schumpeter, an Austrian economist who gives us an imagery around creative destruction and really sits at the heart of a lot of the conversation today around innovation and innovation policy. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of how Exploit, Explore, coming out of strategy, helps us understand what firms do. So in a sense, we want to reimagine a firm from simply a profit-maximizing entity to a source of innovation, often in a wider set of activities. So we want to think about shifting firms from production machines to conveners of ecosystem activity. I know that's a lot of jargon, and I'm going to try to unpack that with a couple of very concrete examples to help us think about that. And then finally, and this is something we've all heard a lot, but it's hard to do, to make experimentation for innovation central. So the gist of what I would like to share with you today and have conversation about is we are using a view, a kind of a pre-World War II view of the firm as a profit-maximizing machine that is increasingly inconsistent with the wisdom that's coming from economists and many other social scientists. And in particular, it's inconsistent with what we know about what some people call evolutionary economics, where we begin to think about markets not as naturally occurring zones, but actually as institutional rules. Somebody makes the rules of the game, there's contest over the rules of the game in a market, and over time, those institutions are designed, in the language of Al Roth, an experimental economist who got the Nobel Prize a few years ago. Those institutions are designed to foster innovation. And so the kind of core argument here is, as we contemplate next steps, 2020 and on, we don't want to go back to business as usual. We don't want to go back to an outdated understanding of both the firm and the wider economy. In some sense, this time is really a continuation of conversations that began a long time ago, but really began in 2008. In the last time, there was a global financial, commercial, and social crisis. So in a way, you could think of the last 20 years as a kind of a conversation that gives us tools to think about rebuilding firms and rebuilding the economy today. Right, let me stop for a second. Any questions you want to pose or anything that's come in from the crowd before I go further?
No, I think if we just get a, the core of your, and then we can dig in a little bit deeper.
Great. Okay. So just really quickly, so a lot of people today know the work of Clay Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma. That's become a kind of a touchstone whenever we think about innovation. I want to kind of challenge us to appreciate Clay Christensen's work, this idea of the disruptive innovation, but really begin to imagine what does that look like, not in a narrow technical space, but really when we try to grab and understand disruptions in energy, robotics, transportation, sanitation, water provisioning. In other words, how do we have to think about innovation? Christensen gave us a very compelling idea that new technologies come along. They initially are not that appealing or that efficient or that productive, but over time they develop and become impactful enough to displace the current imagery, the current infrastructure. That's an idea that has roots in Schumpeter and others. Schumpeter a long time ago, Schumpeter 80 years ago gave us that idea of creative destruction. I'll just remind you briefly. Schumpeter said every era is marked by a stable ecosystem of technologies and the complementary assets and the infrastructure that support those technologies, and those give birth to markets and industries. And his point was that becomes a stable set of interacting elements that becomes quite productive. The creative destruction story there, though, is new technologies come along, new ways of organizing, new materials, new forms of governance. They emerge as well because the world is a complex, contested place. Those newer ways of doing things come along and may well displace the old order. So that's the destructive part. The creative part, though, is for Schumpeter is that new set of activities in displacing the old order frees up resources, financial capital, human capital, talent, energy. It allows those resources, financial capital and human capital and others, that were locked into the old ways of doing things to be freed up, to recombine, importantly for him, to recombine into new kinds of activities, new kinds of energy, new kinds of imaginations. And so that is creative and destructive, not at the individual level. In fact, as we know, that process of creative destruction is very difficult. Firms go bankrupt, industries disappear, careers and lives are severely impacted. So the Schumpeter argument is not a happy argument or an easy argument. Schumpeter would say, it's actually how capitalism works. It keeps redigesting itself. It keeps incorporating new institutional arrangements. And over time, that is both predictable and recognizable. So the creative destruction part there is not a good or happy story. It's descriptive of how the world works. I think Christensen follows through on that with his idea, and again, in a much more focused, technical way. But that raises for us this question: what do you do as an executive? What do you do as a government leader? What do you do as someone in a civil society agency who is trying to cope with this kinds of turbulence? I think the answer that I'm going to say comes from the work of a group of people, political scientists, economists, innovation colleagues, often associated with Carnegie Mellon University, or in the mid-century, the mid-20th century, Carnegie Tech. And really, this work made most visible to us through the work of James March, a dear colleague at Stanford University, recently deceased, and people like Mike Tushman in the management world. And they got us to think about something very interesting. They said too often firms, when we think about firms as production machines, are too focused on making money today and insufficiently focused on building capabilities that will let them not only survive but prosper tomorrow. So this ratio of exploit to explore is a very powerful conversation to have with the most senior colleagues, board members, C-suite, on through the entire organization. It's a conversation that says for a long time, we could be really successful doing what we've always done, but doing it better or more efficiently or more reliably. And that claim is very powerful. And for many decades, that claim was a workable recipe for success. Do more of what we do already, but do it better, more efficiently, more reliably. In periods of turmoil, though, and particularly in the last couple of decades, that recipe, do more of what we did yesterday to have it tomorrow, is increasingly suspect. It's increasingly unclear that that's correct. We have a whole spate of stumbles by large firms. Prominently, we've all talked about Kodak. More recently, we could talk about Blockbuster. We could talk about WeWorks in recent times in the digital space. We see firms that were very successful under one set of conditions, but as those conditions shift, they are less able to make the transition and to continue on. So the explore story here becomes a reminder at the most senior levels of decision making in terms of criteria for what is a good decision, in terms of the purposeful trajectory of firms. We need to begin to think about what is that ratio of exploit to explore. In colloquial terms, in everyday terms, how much of what we do today has to be about today, making money today, but also how much of today has to begin to be about tomorrow, building capabilities, building competence, building imagination, and importantly today, building relationships. We live in times that are shaped by platforms and increasingly by platform economies, where the focus of competition is less at the level of individual firms and much more at the level of wider sets of firms, platforms, ecosystems, networks. All those languages become important. So exploit explore is a really interesting claim that says the old model, do more of what we did yesterday for tomorrow, while it had value at many times and places, is less and less likely to help us. The exploit explore story also reminds us firms need to begin to build capabilities to explore all the time, particularly in times of turbulence. And I want to give you a couple of examples of that, and then we'll open up for back and forth. This slide is just an Oxford strategy proposition. My colleagues at Oxford and I are broadly, we are eclectic. We're also probably not, we're what you might call heterodox strategy faculty. We do not share in some of the mainstream assumptions. We think, and as I said here, the greatest challenge that corporations face is to survive and thrive in a time of unprecedented turbulence. That insight requires different ways of imagining the firm, the role of top leadership and executive, and the nature of linkages to wider ecosystem. We say here the roots of the challenge are well known: globalization, developments in technology, the empowerment of digitally conscious consumers and citizens, and then something we know well today, geopolitical and economic instability. We could add to that public health, the pandemic, and kind of new recognitions of the global nature of public health. The claim here, and this is the knowledge-based claim in the work of many colleagues, the Schumpeter-based claim, most of that knowledge and capability needed to do this already exists somewhere, albeit it's isolated or hidden in exceptional pockets of best practice. It's in your supply base, it's in your operations, or with your customers. I'll remind everyone of a quote from William Gibson, a well-known quote from the science fiction writer William Gibson. He said, "The future is already here. It is just very unevenly distributed." And that point about the bullet point here, a lot of what we know, what we need to know about going forward, we already have available to us. We just aren't connected to it, or we haven't assembled it, or we haven't put the pieces together. And so a lot of the work of Explore is really about understanding how do you build capabilities to notice, to see out in the world beyond existing incumbent ways of doing things, to imagine what's possible. And then lastly, that last point there, what's required there for new forms of collaboration that make the exceptional normal and so enable greater economic efficiency, drive innovation, manage the environmental risks, and so forth. So this proposition is sort of at the heart of what I'm asking you to reflect on today and to build into your own leadership and your own practice. None of it is new. None of it is unfamiliar. It is provocative, though. It does involve reimagining the nature of the firm, and in that way, building up an economy not only comprised of firms, but also with recognition to the many other stakeholders and the many other kinds of organizations, regulatory organizations, civil society organizations, all the kinds of organizations that we're interdependent on to engage and solve real issues in transportation or sanitation or healthcare or other areas. Again, this idea is familiar. Our colleague at Oxford, the chair of our school board, Paul Pullman, has led many senior executives in this conversation. Other political leaders are saying the same thing. There's broad convergence around saying the challenge is not to make money by creating harms. The challenge is how to make money by doing well, by solving problems in the world rather than creating them. And that's, in a sense, that language. The challenge is to make money by solving problems in the world, not creating them, is a long conversation related to how people used to think about externalities, for example, in pollution and the environment. The question is not how to mitigate pollution, but how to solve environmental sustainability issues. That's a very bold and ambitious agenda. It's an agenda uniquely suited to times like this, times of turbulence, times of economic disarray, times of political and social tumult. In other words, the exploit, explore analysis, that conversation with your colleagues, with your stakeholders, with your teams, that conversation, how much of today is about today and how much of today needs to be about tomorrow, is an important curative to the over-focus on, only focused on today. Two examples. We're involved in a research project now with colleagues at University of Manchester as part of COVID-19, as part of that recovery activity. We're interested in two kinds of cases. One is the Nightingale Hospital. Some of you will know this is a series of UK-based, in a sense, pop-up hospitals. I use that term not to be silly, but to say these are hospitals that are built and created in short term. They reflect a long history of the experience of the military in many countries who are able to deploy and create field-level hospitals within days. So the Nightingales are an effort to cope with the pandemic surge, to equip and mobilize UK resources to support the people and support the national, the NHS, the National Health System. The other case we're looking at is, some of you know, the case of the vaccine trials occurring at the University of Oxford, at the Jenner Institute. This has got a lot of media lately. In both cases, though, these are processes of innovation that involve reimagining how we currently do things, accelerating the process of innovation through clinical trials, through regulatory activity, through using modular activities. And in a way, these two cases, the Nightingales is a story about creating a template, a modular template for a hospital, and then proliferating that in different spaces. And it raises these very interesting questions around what are the supply chains that have to be in place, and what are the regulatory processes that we need to manage to get that done. But it's a modular story. Take the same model and move it across different contexts, different terrains. The vaccine story is an interesting story. It's a different story. It's not a modular story. It's saying at the Jenner Institute, over the last 30 years, researchers and other colleagues have been exploring viruses. They've been exploring large-scale production of vaccines. In other words, in their own specialty areas, they've been experimenting from the legacy of SARS and MERS through COVID-19, from the legacy of large-scale production of vaccines, from the kind of experience of trying to test populations. Those colleagues are not using a modular form. They're actually assembling, in that Schumpeterian way, they're assembling insights from many different trials, from many different initiatives, to help us understand a solution to the contemporary development and production of a COVID-19 relevant vaccine. So I put this slide in to remind us, this is real time. We are watching firms and other agencies manage in new ways. They are taking seriously the long-linked nature of collaboration. They're taking seriously the idea of recombining elements that were fit for purpose in one setting, but have to be taken out of that setting, recombined, and made fit for a new purpose. I'll give you one other example and then wrap up. We've done a lot of work on the changing space in the UK of the energy services markets. This is the shift over the last decade from the 6 large incumbent energy services providers, then watching the development of several score new digital energy services providers and how they are reshaping their activities. Here we take from some work we've done on OVO Energy, a now well-regarded and recognized digital energy services provider that in recent year has also bought the retail business of SSE and really become, by doing that, one of the large players in the UK. These are entrepreneurial startups who make, as you can see from the graph here, who make links to many different players, government players, partners in other industries, mobility, energy, financial services. They are assembling over time, and this is a composite visual, over 10 years, but where they have done experiments, learning, trying things out, assembling new relationships. This is exploit, explore in practice. And this is also the way that many firms are beginning to understand how you build capacity and how you succeed. The boundaries of traditional firms are less, of traditional industries are less and less stable. And these firms are actually these interesting kind of composite entities who build capabilities to manage relationships, as you see in this diagram, to virtual power plants, to the flexibility of the energy grid, to trading, to mobility, the electrification of transport, to smart homes and the revolution in batteries and energy storage in those smart homes. This last slide then is just a tempo graphic that shows us the same UK OVO Energy, the range of relationships and partnerships and engagements and firms they have built over these 10 years, right? It reminds us of both the complexity and the possibility that comes from complexity. This is more like the Jenner Institute vaccine trials. This is not a modular template. This is a series of relationships and experiences and capabilities borrowed and bundled together into something today, UK OVO Energy Services, that we could have hardly imagined 5 years ago, let alone a decade ago. That for me is the gist of really exploring, exploit, explore in the context of recovery and renewal. Let me stop here with some comments from my colleague Rafael Ramirez, who summarizes this by saying, whatever strategy used to be, whatever Michael Porter thought strategy was, that has not been the case for a long time. Today, instead, we focus on reinventing value, and really the key strategic task is to reconfigure roles and relationships across uncharted spaces, right? There's no sign here saying, do this. Instead, firms have to explore, imagine, fail, learn from that failure, and over time, as I just showed you in the UK energy space, build new kinds of capabilities and new kinds of relationships. Roddy, let me stop there. Comments, questions?
That's brilliant. Let me see if we can bring ourselves back. Do you want to stop sharing the screen, see if we can come back? Yeah, well, there's a huge amount in there, isn't there?
I hope that's the reason.
But trying to condense it and identify the key elements. I mean, there's an element of that increased pace of change that everyone's aware of, and that period that in the 1950s and 1960s companies could rely on a long sense of their company being at that mature stage where profits were verging on the supernormal, and and therefore to line their pockets nicely for that. And we're shifting this ambidexterity. There's got to be more focus now on preparing for the future than just making money at the moment. So that's it. So one side, but also I'm hugely aware that although Mark, you're sitting in California at the moment, you're an integral part of Oxford site, and it has a big focus on public value. And Colin Mayer wrote the book around the firm, 5, 6, 7 years ago. How much of this is also tied up with the shift away from maximizing shareholder value to that wider stakeholder value, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the work I'm talking about, the research I'm talking about, and the cases are really agnostic about shareholder primacy. That's a 40-year-old idea that's kind of much contested now. And as you said, my colleague Colin Mayer, a very distinguished financial economist and comparative governance scholar, has really prompted us to realize the nearness, the recentness of that idea of shareholder value. I think what I'm describing to you says it really comes out of this innovation tradition, Schumpeter on, that says innovation is about a lot of things. It's about technology, but it's also about forms of governance, kinds of supply chains, products and services, and overall organization. So in Schumpeterian terms, it's not surprising. Shareholder value was an idea fit for purpose in that immediate post-war period, what he said, affluence, relative stability and profits, relative institutional stability at the global level, a few large firms dominating large parts of the globe. That was a particular historical era, and shareholder value kind of made sense then. If you reflect on it, though, it never really even made sense for most firms in the world that were outside the Anglo-American tradition. So the large-scale conglomerates of South and East Asia, the emerging roles of firms in China, Russia, India, the idea of shareholder value was never even that well developed in those places, right? So I think that the conversation I'm asking is to have is to say, in times of turbulence, what do firms do and how do they go forward? And by definition, what they do is they connect and build these more distributed sets of relationships, which in terms of that shareholder value argument often make more complex who's accountable to whom. And so for a number of years, people really downplayed the importance of conglomerates or downplayed multi-line of business firms for the reason that they made it hard to draw that kind of clear accountability. What we know today and what we see around the world is the renewal of interest in conglomerates, multi-line of business firms. Why? Because they're more resilient. Why? Because they provide internal markets to support and grow the business. And so, again, that I use the word ideological fad to simplify. We're now in a time when many firms in many parts of the world are once again large-scale conglomerates. Does that raise other issues? Yes, of course. Does it raise issues of corruption? Does it raise issues of discretion, managerial discretion and accountability? Yes, of course, right? But I guess I would say in times of turmoil, in times of turbulence, when we're experiencing the remaking of core parts of the economy, those kinds of, I'm going to call them conglomerates, that is large pools of capital, talent, ability across many industries, actually become sources of value and sustainability. I think Colin and many other colleagues are arguing that we have to rethink the firm to really take cognizance of the limits of the planet. I think everyone knows that catchphrase, planets, profits, and people, that recognize three elements to which firms have to be accountable both in the near term and the long term. For me, the Exploit Explore conversation is an opportunity for executives and others to really engage that conversation. What is about today? What has to be happening today to enable us to have it tomorrow?
And so from a point of view of inside the firm. I mean, I think what we're seeing here, and that last, or second last graphic you showed of OVO's sort of extraordinary increase in number of relationships it's having with competitors too. I mean, that's what's really striking. Is this evolution from being a very singular, hard-bounded entity to something where the boundaries are much more porous and there's much more interchange that we're seeing. And so these ecosystems are becoming more and more critical. But we also know that in large organizations, the ecosystem mentality is one that's extremely difficult for people who have been in a managerial role to embrace. It happens better in small startup where you can't do everything yourself. But in a big organization, that's a problem. So how do we go about trying to change
Good question, Roddy. Let me give you an incomplete answer, and then we could go back and forth a little bit. So I think your broad point is right. I think that what we learn from smaller firms is that ability to be plurally dexterous, to be able to do a lot of things, is more common. One of the things we know is that as firms become larger, they tend to become more hierarchical, they tend to become more internal looking, and that tends to account for what you described. Many thoughtful people look at the Kodak experience and say, it would be incorrect to say that Kodak didn't understand digital technology. As you probably know, in the 1980s, Kodak owned 30% of the patents around digital technology. So it'd be incorrect to say they didn't get the technology. It would be incorrect to say that Kodak didn't understand the kind of the transformation of their markets, right? They had data, they believed the China market would last a long time. So the conventional accounts of Kodak are, I think, incomplete. What happened at Kodak? Just what you said, 26 divisions, where becoming a division chief was a lifelong aspiration, and where people built careers to ascend to those division chief roles. That creates an enormous amount of inertia, enormous amount of duplication, enormous amounts of difficulty to be flexible. We know in general that those kinds of organizations, it's hard for them to be flexible and hard for them to be responsive to the wider space. Today, though, many firms hire. The Chinese firm is probably one of the most notable. Many of the Scandinavian firms, some German firms, are actually pushing discretion to the edges. So Hire and other of those firms are often seen as consortia of 100 enterprises, where each of the enterprises pursues agendas relevant to itself. You may recall the firm Asea Brown Boveri, ABB, in the 80s and 90s. Very brilliant leadership, amazing successes. An alternative to the GE model, they didn't try to cut programs and get out of businesses. They instead put in place an accountability mechanism of a very thin reporting system weekly from 187 businesses in 90 countries. On Friday morning, each of those businesses would turn in 7 indicators. The leadership, a small group of people, a relatively small team, 20 people in headquarters, would look at those indicators, those dashboards, and notice what was wrong. And by intent, there weren't enough for them to do anything about it. They had to call the local people, they had to call the local leadership and ask them what was happening. So we have lots of examples where firms have come up with interesting accountability tools that let the center notice the overall patterns and obviously deviations from expectations, but still focus action at the local level. So I think you're right. The clunky model of an Anglo-American multinational firm is very different from some of the pioneering experiences we see over time and today, particularly with regard to some of the Chinese firms that are imagining control and accountability in different ways.
That's great, and we've got some questions coming in, and I encourage people to please use the question panel to add some questions. But we've got there's more than a question here from Vanessa, but I think it gets to the nub of just what you were saying there, Mark. She writes, I think the strength of smaller teams is that decisions can be made and implemented sooner. Part of helping a big firm innovate is allowing innovation to happen without 16 layers of approval. And she goes on, we need to leave space for mistakes. So let me leave that hanging, but also there's a went off the screen. A comment from Sandy here, going, given the significant difference between the capabilities required to explore and exploit, can you share views on firms' options to pursue both in terms of structure and culture? So I mean, I think there's a bit of both in that. So
there's both, yeah, really good questions. Thank you both. So let me speak to both issues. Absolutely, exploit and explore require fundamentally different capabilities, different culture, different accountability structures, different kinds of decision-making discretion. I think we all know the explore model. It's 30 years of conversation around how you have Skunkworks or Xerox PARC, all the efforts to create physically and culturally separate units that in fact do generate experiments and innovation. And those stand in contrast to the core or mainstream firm where there's much tighter accountability, quarterly reporting, kind of making your numbers and making your targets. As you both said, those are two different worlds. And part of the genius of the efforts of people like Tushman at Harvard and many of his colleagues has been to say we need to imagine leadership and management structures in what they call ambidextrous organizations, from the old Latin root ambidextrous, both hands, equally dexterous, both hands. And so they would say their solution is, yeah, you build those separate organizations, explore those capabilities, and then you link them at the most senior levels. That has two implications. One is it means the work of the senior leaders is not to run the business today, it's to actually shape that linkage between today and tomorrow. So that's a very different ask for a C-suite. It implies somebody needs to be competent and run the organization on its own terms today, and the work of the CEO, the chair, the leadership team, the managing board is actually to reconcile today and tomorrow, but that becomes the task. The second implication of that is that's a structural solution. It's still within the concept of a hierarchy. It's still a way of saying, oh yeah, those ambidextrous firms, they need to figure out how to reconcile those competing agendas, not on a daily basis, but at the level of formal structural leadership. Now, some of us don't find that a compelling answer. So I would say the research on that is probably 20 years old at the most, really 10 years old. And there's a large group of colleagues that are really exploring the relative success of ambidextrous organization, the trade-offs, the tensions in exploit explore. We're early days in that knowledge. I think Tushman and his colleagues have really given us that structural solution. Build these two cultures, build these two organizations, and then link them at the most senior levels of the firm with that idea that the senior levels of the firm are not running the firm today, they're building the firm over time. I think that's where we are today. I think there's going to be a whole generation of experiments. As Sadi was saying a minute ago, as I was saying, we're in a time of large-scale learning from Chinese state-owned enterprises, the increasingly active Russian space, India, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brazil, Canada. And, we're learning from many kinds of firms that are less closely linked to that shareholder primacy model, both in their practices and their governance. I could list for you Unilever, DSM, many of the firms are taking, large multinational firms that are taking the lead in purpose, conversations on corporate purpose. We're in an exciting time of experimentation and ferment, and we need to notice it in those ways and realize we're going to be learning a lot in the next 20 years. As the economy begins to digest and shift, so will firms be exploring and learning. On Vanessa's kind of concrete point, yeah, a ton of evidence that says small teams are more agile, more flexible. Like any good division of labor, the challenge is how do you then reintegrate that local flexibility and learning into the broader purposes and goals of the firm. And this is something Google has struggled with. You may know a series of experiments and studies done by Google colleagues at Google and many others. Famously, a set of articles in the media about 3 years ago on how Google really took incredibly good data on 3,000 teams and tried to understand what made them effective and what not. Their statistical analyses were inconclusive. They ended up citing the work of Amy Edmondson, a distinguished scholar of leadership and organization, and saying it was those teams that created safe spaces, that created spaces where people could openly dissent and agree and debate. Those were the teams that worked regardless of composition or size of the team or nature of the technology. The argument was confidence that people could speak out and not be punished, confidence that they could try ideas out in the safety of the team emerges as a powerful idea. Again, these are experiments. These are times of learning. I guess my comment overall would be we're in an incredible time of learning. I'd say that's turbulence. We're in a time of global pandemic, which I think will probably become more difficult in the next year. We're in a time of economic downturns in many parts of the world. You know, those are times when wise organizations invest and innovate. We learn in conditions of duress. Now, the work of that as a leader is incredibly hard. You have to be articulate, thoughtful. You have to bring along many stakeholders. You have to talk in ways that give people both a sense of the possible and also a sense of pragmatically, today, what do I need to do? So this is not easy work, and this is the work that Roddy and his team have been doing for a long time. How do you help leaders become really effective at the very difficult work of leading in these complex times? So I don't want to at all minimize, like what I'm saying today is not, oh, I've solved it, let's go. I want to say instead, I'm framing.
It'd be much better if you had.
Well, sorry, but I want to say that framing an agenda for all of us to really dig in, learn from each other, understand, you know, and this is by way of summary, 3 core points. The world is turbulent. That's getting us to rethink what we think firms do and what the economy is. We want to begin to think about explore, that is that temporal sensitivity. How much of today is about today? How much of today is about tomorrow? And how do we talk about that with clients, stakeholders, board members? How do we have those conversations? And then finally, experimentation and innovation are at the heart of renewal, and that's where we need to go.
Thank you. Now, I'm aware of time. We're coming up to the top of the hour, and we normally like to be very prompt on these things, but I think given the difficulties we had bringing you on at the beginning, Mark, let's see if we can run this. If you've got another 10, 12 minutes, that would be great. There's some questions coming in here from Andrew Campbell, who you may know, and he's sort of questioning whether it's the issue is actually around the firm, or it's more the change is driven entirely by the marketplace. And he makes the point that we made several points here. Let me try and summarize them. But you know, the thinnest layer of management control is the marketplace, because it has the biggest impact, and no management can fight against it. But he's also saying that he's got some skepticism around explore, because inevitably it means investing money in things that are going to fail, and big organizations are set up so that they that they invest in what gives the highest and best immediate return.
Yeah. So great questions, and really important debate. I would say that we can join. Let me make a few very brief comments, and maybe we'll go back and forth. The conception that the market is ultimately the control probably makes a lot of sense. Markets, though, in traditional neoclassic theory, markets have no temporal sensibility, right? What is a market? If supply and demand clears at that point of equilibrium, price emerges endogenously, Pareto optimal world. That notion of price is time homogeneous. In other words, there is no conception of time in that classical view. And so the market today is making decisions about the market today. It assumes that tomorrow will follow from that. I think we saw this, one of the strongest cases in recent times where we've seen of the incompleteness of market solutions or market allocation processes is in the case around PPE under the pandemic, when we see what some economists call price gouging, or surge pricing, what other economists say is the natural response of the market to limits of supply and to excesses of demand. So that kind of helps us realize the market is good as is really its discipline is a discipline for allocating today. If we begin to realize that today is not necessarily continuous with tomorrow, then the market, as appealing as that is, as efficient as it is for today, becomes an unhelpful or an incomplete discipline for the longer term. And much of the debate, as you know, today is about the longer term. It's the critique of short-termism. It's the awareness that the long term, the long now, the language some people use, is infinitely made up of many, many todays in a cascade. So the quick point is, markets do exert a kind of discipline. That discipline is time insensitive, and that may be a source of difficulty. Second point, markets are also political constructions. Markets are institutional arrangements. If we step back from that kind of neoclassical model of the market, supply and demand equilibrate, we realize somebody builds markets, either governments or dominant incumbent actors or entrepreneurs or lawyers or whoever. Markets are not naturally occurring; they are built. They are built objects, and so this is where we get into this now. In the extreme, this is the argument. Some of you know Marc Ventresca at UCL, an economist who has become very prominent the last few years for bringing these arguments around innovation in the long term. As she and many others would say, the extreme forms of that are state socialism and all the inefficiencies there. The reality, though, as Ventresca would say, when we look at the rise of modern innovation, that is funding by mostly the U.S. military agencies, DARPA and others, as well as European agencies, not in an organized way, but across many different entities, to many different firms, to many different universities. So there's a plurality, a heterodox view there that says the state intervenes not simply to fix broken markets, but also to enable the kinds of markets we need. That is, markets that are attentive for the long term. Same thing I could say, and everyone knows this, I think, the emergence of large, long-term asset holders, the pension funds that have become so dominant in the public markets. Those long-term holders of capital who are holding money for 30 or 50 or 70 years are increasingly restive at the idea of day-to-day short-term gains. This is the evolution of BlackRock. Some people are following that conversation, where both the long-term pensions and their intermediaries are increasingly skeptical of the near-term, moment-to-moment discipline of the market. And so I think we're in a time of reimagining both honestly what are markets and how they work, and whether the power of the market for efficient allocation in that atemporal sense, that is today, as if today were also tomorrow and yesterday, that's becoming a really interesting debate.
Which is a perfect segue into the question here from Usman, who I think he says he was one of your students. I don't know how recently or long ago, but he asks, how can we have the
hello, former student.
How can we have the explore exploit conversation with that key stakeholder, the investor? So that's just what you were referring to then.
Yeah. It's a great question. I think exploit explore starts out as a conversation within the firm or the agency. It's about helping people understand why what they do today is incredibly important and critical, but also what they do today has to take into account what's possible for tomorrow. So our colleague, Stuart Kaufman, a computational biologist at Santa Fe Institute, talks a lot about what he calls the adjacent possible. What are the actions that are taken today that make possible tomorrow? What's opening up and what's closing down? And so I think first, Usman, you have that conversation internally. You line up your team, you understand exactly what you need to do to be successful today, but also to invest and build capabilities for tomorrow. Then you start going to investors. Again, long and short-term investors are going to have different sensibilities. The long-term investors are the people that are going to help you really steer for the longer term. And those are conversations that I think are pretty obvious. They're happening with institutional investors, they're happening in intermediaries, they're happening in financial services, they're happening in regulatory agencies. Increasingly, we're adding a time subscript to those debates. Short-term investors are a much tougher idea. Like as a good faculty, as a good teacher, I'd say you educate people why their near-term interest is actually in understanding the long-term. If someone is literally a day trader, somebody is literally wanting supernormal profits today, they're going to be a tough sell to help them understand why the long-term is better for the firm. This also raises a really important question that was not on the agenda 10 or 15 years ago, which is what several people are suggesting. Why should firms persist? Why do we try to adapt? Why do we manage for the long term? Think of the firm as a pool of capital, optimize the rents extracted from that capital today, and then help with after that. So that's a view that's increasingly getting voice in jurisprudence, in corporate law, in public policy, that says, why should we worry about the longer term? Why not just optimize rent collection or rent extraction today? And then in tributary terms, that firm fails, those assets are recombined, and we move on. The challenge there, it's an important conversation to have. The challenge, of course, is it underspecifies all the stakeholders other than the shareholders. And that's the challenge in that debate, which at first blush, the kind of libertarian argument is very appealing. Extract rents today, make them, optimize on our technologies, on current markets, extract rents, and then in tributary terms, the firm dies, those assets are recombined and put to new uses. But again, the critique there is that really only attends to shareholders as the only stakeholder.
No, I mean that's a really interesting dynamic, isn't it, of shifting? But the firm in its sort of public form, its stock market form is merely a construct in order to be able to raise capital. I mean, otherwise the original owners would never have given away those shares, would they? So it's to do with access to capital, and we're seeing lots of different ways of that coming in now.
I think that's you mentioned Colin Mayer, my colleague Colin Mayer, who brilliantly has said that idea is an 80-year-old idea. It's an 80-year-old solution to how do you raise capital. If you go back to the British East Indies Company, if you go back to the trading companies of the 18th and 19th century, if you look at some of the long-term capital funds, the sovereign debt fund, if you look at these, we're in a period of experimentation with many models of how do you pool capital and how do you access capital. And in many ways, the debates over shareholder value are kind of an anachronism. They're the last battles over one model of how you access capital, and we're watching the birth of new ways of doing that. Again, colleagues, a lot of historical sociologists, economic sociologists, innovation theorists like Mariano Mazzucato, economists, institutional economists are saying we need new institutions. We need long-term venture capital funds, not flipping in 3 to 5 years, but with a 30 or 40-year horizon. What is that going to look like? Who's going to build those? Are those going to be public-private ventures, joint ventures? Like, we're in a period of incredible excitement and experimentation with just that question that you're raising and that others are raising, right? I think, again, I'm asking people to have a kind of an historical mindset here. We're one moment in a set of trajectories. We're in the middle of a bunch of experiments where there are legacy incumbent forms like venture capital or like the Anglo-American model of the shareholder primacy firm. Those are models that are in the flow. There are debates, boundary skirmishes, and increasingly, and this is important, the provision of alternatives. Will all those alternatives work out? Probably not. But we're in the business of providing alternatives, seeing how they work, seeing which gets traction. That's the essence of innovation. Lots of variance, and then you put in place some kind of selection regime that sorts through the variance, and you retain some fit forms. And I think that same thing is true for the financial markets today.
Brilliant. I mean, we've had a couple of webinars recently, or in the last few months, on looking at family businesses, and they obviously are, the oldest companies in the world are family businesses, but that's just because the joint stock company didn't exist 500 years ago. So they're at a disadvantage there. But but there is something around that stewardship, that focus on your people rather than your product that I think it is worth sharing.
We have my dean, Peter DeFano, and a number of our senior postdocs, Mary Johnson-Louis and Bridget Custon, have a brilliant project called the Ownership Project, which is really exploring the long-term comparative fate of family-owned firms. And again, that's a really interesting renewed conversation on governance for just the reasons you're saying. Stewardship, purpose, long-term, those are baked into most of the family firms. And so they're a natural experiment in understanding what that looks like. And the questions from Vanessa and others earlier, what does that look like in terms of the teams and the small groups within the firm? What does it look like in terms of governance, coupled with the always complex family dynamics? So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, Mark, I think we are out of time, but thank you so much. This is a huge topic, and we could be going on for hours. But thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry for the hassle.
And apologies to others for the technology issue at the beginning, but as we all aware, these do happen from time to time. We are back on Monday, in fact, with Professor Ella Washington from Georgetown University, who will be speaking on improving diversity and inclusion, which couldn't be a more timely topic all of a sudden. So if you haven't signed up for that, please look for it on our website and do so. But before we go, there is a slide. I don't know if I'm going to be able to share it, but Mark, you've got programs on this topic, and if you just want to give a minute on that.
And also an online program called the Oxford Strategic Innovation Program, which we offer. Another version of that is starting on the 10th of June, and then another in the fall. These are 6-week modular online courses. Very much welcome people exploring those and or contacting me. Happy to talk about the group we have and also the online courses in innovation in these ways.
If I'm still sharing my screen, I think people should see something about those now. But great, Mark, thank you very much indeed. It's always a pleasure working with you. Have a good rest of your day. And thank you to all who have joined us. It's great to have you with us.
Good day, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Roddy. Thank you, the Oxford team, and also your team. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.